In today's lesson, we're going to talk about what a terminal emulator is and a few different methods on how to gain access to a Linux system. If you already have access to a Linux system, feel free to skip ahead. A terminal is a hardware device that allows you to enter data into a computer and for that computer to display data back to you. In the past, terminals were typically connected to computers or servers via a cable of some sort, typically a serial cable. Terminals themselves actually look like computers. They have a keyboard for entering in data, a display to display the data back. The big difference between a terminal and a computer is that a terminal is worthless unless it's connected to a real computer or a server. This is why you'll sometimes hear terminals referred to as dumb terminals. Today, terminals are obsolete. We still need to enter data into a computer and allow a computer to display data back to us, but the technology has changed. Instead of using a terminal to connect to a Linux server, what we do today is use a terminal emulator application that acts as if it were the terminal. You can use a terminal emulator application to communicate with your local computer. For instance, if you are running Linux as your primary desktop and you are using a graphical user interface, you could start up a terminal emulator application in order to interact with the command line of Linux. If you are using Windows as your primary desktop, you could start a terminal emulator application and connect to a Linux server over the network. In order to practice the skills you'll be gaining in this course, you're going to need access to a Linux system. One quick and easy way to do that is to open up a web browser and visit simpleshell.com. Simpleshell.com allows you to connect to a Linux server. You just click Start My Session and a terminal emulator opens up. Each session is limited to 15 minutes. So if you just want to spend just a couple of minutes trying out a new command that you're learning about, this would be a great way to practice that. If you have your own website, you very well may have access to a Linux account. Many times shared hosting providers use Linux as the operating system which runs their web servers. Look at your web hosting company's documentation and look for the words shell access or SSH. SSH stands for Secure Shell, and SSH is a network protocol. It allows you to take your terminal emulator application and connect it over the network to a Linux server. Shared web hosting is typically inexpensive. It's usually only a few dollars a month. Some of the same companies that provide web hosting services also provide virtual private servers, sometimes called VPS for short. These virtual private servers run complete operating systems, and they're not shared. So only you have an account for this entire operating system. And you can do anything with this virtual server that you could a real physical server. Again, since it's not shared and you have full control over the server, you can reboot it at will. This is not such a good thing if you're in a shared hosting environment. That's why your accounts in those environments have limited access. If you like the idea of having full control over a virtual server, you could look into cloud computing as well. In cloud speak, a virtual server is called an instance. You'll hear people talking about spinning up an instance. That simply means they've deployed a virtual server running a complete operating system. One of the main differences between cloud providers and traditional web hosting providers that provide shared hosting and virtual private servers is that cloud servers or cloud instances can be programmatically deployed. That means you can create software that starts cloud instances or stops cloud instances. In our case, we just want access to a Linux server, so you don't have to take advantage of those features if you don't want them. Just know that VPS, a virtual private server, or a cloud instance are all the same thing. Another way to get access to a Linux server is to run a live Linux distribution. A live Linux distro typically runs from CD or USB key or a DVD-ROM. You insert the bootable media, start your hardware, and in just a few minutes you are placed into a live running Linux operating system. The reason why they're called live Linux distributions is they do not write to your hard drive. They are not installed on your computer. They're just live. So they run as long as the power's on. The minute you reboot your computer, your operating system is gone. The advantage of using a live Linux distribution is that you can try something out without modifying your computer. The disadvantage of using a live Linux distribution is that when you're using it, you don't have access to your primary operating system. For example, if you're watching this course on your Windows PC and you wanted to try a few new Linux commands that you've learned about, You would have to stop your Windows operating system, put in a CD, and power up the computer again in order to boot into Linux. It's important to keep in mind that live Linux distros shouldn't be used to evaluate performance of Linux. When you're running a live distro, you're typically running it from a storage device that is a lot slower than your normal hard drive. A few live Linux distributions that are fairly popular include Fedora, Knoppix, Puppy Linux, and Ubuntu. Live Linux distros by default do not modify your system in any way. They won't write to your hard drive, for instance. However, most live Linux distributions do include a utility to install the distro to your hard drive if you decide you like it. Of course, you can always install Linux on a computer. If you have an extra laptop or an old PC that you're not using anymore, then pick a Linux distribution and install it directly on that. If you do decide to install Linux yourself, don't worry if there are things in the installation process that don't make sense or that you don't fully understand. Typically, the defaults are pretty safe. Just accept the defaults and you should be good to go. The last method I'm going to talk about today is using pre-installed Linux images with VirtualBox. This is the method that I recommend you use with this course. VirtualBox is virtualization software. It allows you to run entire operating systems within your current operating system. Your current operating system is called the host, or the host operating system, and the virtual machines that you'll be creating are called guests. Like Linux, VirtualBox is free and open source software. VirtualBox runs on Mac, Windows, and even Linux. In the next part of the course, I will show you how to install VirtualBox on Windows and also how to install it on Mac. From there, I will show you how to get the pre-installed Linux images and how to import those into VirtualBox. Then we can get started with the main course content. The ways to get access to a Linux system include going to simpleshell.com in your web browser, using a hosting provider, be that a shared web host, a VPS host, or a cloud host. You can install Linux on hardware, and you can also run Linux inside a virtual machine.